The sun pressed hard against the tarmac, turning the air above it into a wavering shimmer that made the distant edges of the field blur and dance. In the center of the commotion, fighter jets glinted like showroom models, their polished shells catching every camera angle. Their crews moving with choreographed energy as reporters circled and flashes popped. But beyond the spotlight, near the edge where the concrete gave way to gravel, a different shape sat still. It was a C-130 cargo plane, weathered and dull, its paint faded to soft gray, its body silent and heat-worn. No one pointed their lens at it. No one called its name. And yet beside it stood a woman, part in sun, part in shade. Her frame relaxed, one gloved hand resting on a clipboard. She wasn't posturing. She wasn't watching the show. She was simply there, checking the plane not by sight, but by feel, as if the machine and her shared the same memory. Her name wasn't printed on the event schedule. Her plane wasn't listed for takeoff, but there was something in her stance that made it clear she didn't need permission to be ready. While others posed for pictures, she moved with a kind of quiet certainty that said she wasn't waiting for anyone to call her name. She already knew what had to be done. Nico Rowe didn't walk with the weight of wanting to be seen. She was in her early 40s, with sun-marked skin and a calm expression that rarely shifted, even when others around her reached for attention. Her uniform was older than most on the field, seams softened by years of wear. The sleeves rolled just high enough to show a line of freckles on her forearms. She wore her flight gloves looped through her belt, the leather cracked and shaped perfectly to her grip. Her boots were clean but not polished, soles worn by miles of ramp and runway. There was nothing flashy about her, and yet she moved with a presence that settled deep into the space she entered. Nico was a second-generation pilot, though she rarely said it. Her mother had flown low-visibility cargo routes in the Pacific back when most people couldn't name a woman who did the same. There was a hand-drawn flight map still folded behind the control panel in Juliet. 4. A chart her mother had made during a blackout run across a storm coast. Nico didn't display it for inspiration. She carried it like a compass buried just under the skin. She never used her mother's name to open doors or win favor. When she entered flight school, she kept quiet during introductions and learned by watching more than speaking. She made her way through one assignment after another, always choosing the harder posts and never asking for reassignment. There were easier paths. Pilots with less time and less skill found seats on cleaner aircraft or cushier contracts, but Nico stayed where the work was real. She didn't need recognition. She needed to know she was useful. Her crew knew it too. Every one of them had flown long enough to recognize the difference between a leader and a talker. Nico didn't waste words. She didn't bark commands. She gave quiet cues. And they followed. Not because of her rank, but because she never missed. She read systems like other people read faces. She could hear the difference in engine balance before a gauge confirmed it. She could spot a cracked seal by the smell of the cabin pressure drop. Nothing about her style was showy, but everything about it was solid. When she walked the length of Juliet 4 in the early morning, her fingers brushed the aircraft like they were reading Braille. She checked bolts by feel, not just sight. She ran her hand along the seam of the wing housing like she was tracing a memory. Nico had no profile on the base website. She didn't have quotes printed in mission briefs. When she walked into the ops tent, no one stopped to ask her thoughts unless they already knew her value. That was fine with her. She wasn't there to be seen. She was there to be ready. In a place full of postures and protocols, her stillness was what made people look twice. She didn't lean in. She stood level. When decisions were made, she didn't argue if they went against her. She just adjusted, recalibrated, and prepared for what she could do with the space left open. And she never made scenes. If someone dismissed her, she let it pass. If someone ignored her, she gave them no correction. But when things went wrong, and they always did, eventually, it was her checklist that kept systems upright. There was a depth to her that didn't show unless you were paying attention. She didn't need people to know her story, but the ones who worked with her long enough could feel its edges. She had flown in places without backup. She had landed on strips half visible through fog. She had waited quietly while younger officers took the spotlight, only to be called when their plans fell apart. To many, she was just the quiet woman beside the old aircraft, but to those who had seen her fly, she was the reason they still trusted the mission. She wasn't the loudest. She wasn't the most decorated, but she was always the one who showed up when it counted. And she had never once waited to be invited to act. The airfield looked like a stage built for performance, not for function. Rows of fighter jets gleamed under spot-cleaned canopies, each surface polished to catch sunlight and camera flashes. Crew members moved in perfect loops around them, practiced and fast, pausing only to angle their bodies toward the media tents. Public affairs had set up a line of cold water tables, branded backdrops, and shaded press areas filled with clean uniforms and perfect smiles. A woman in mirrored aviators called out updates into a handheld mic, her voice sharp and rehearsed as it echoed across the open field. Behind her, a backdrop showed a logo as crisp as her heels. Nearby, pilots gave interviews in perfect posture, their squadron patches angled just right for the frame. Journalists hovered close, cameras snapping fast, every moment designed for reposts and shares. A small screen behind the operations desk scrolled with scheduled launches, each call sign tied to a jet that had already been pre-cleared for broadcast. And far from the spotlight, near the edge where the concrete ended and the gravel began, sat Juliet 4. She wasn't on any list. Her paint had dulled with sun and sand. No camera lens turned her way. No tech clipped cables to her bay. Nico and her team worked in silence, each member moving with quiet precision. Drew crouched at the forward gear, adjusting tire pressure without being told. Ezra stood near a rear panel, eyes fixed on a screen that most people never noticed. Wells leaned against the ramp with one foot on the hitch, saying nothing as the wind picked up dust from under the plane's belly. None of them reached for attention. None of them moved with performative ease. They worked like they always did. Focused, rhythmic, unseen. A junior crewman, walking past with a stack of lanyards for media guests, smirked when he saw them. He tossed a look toward Juliet 4 and muttered something under his breath, just loud enough to hear. Something about museum pieces and cargo not needing cameras. Nico didn't react. She noted a pressure reading with a pencil, made a small correction to the checklist, and moved on. Her crew didn't flinch. They didn't break their rhythm. They had heard it all before. Inside the operations tent, a widescreen monitor displayed every jet scheduled for departure. Their flight paths had been drawn in clean arcs across digital terrain. Juliet 4's space on the grid remained blank, marked only as pending support, which meant no slot, no clearance, no place in the spotlight. Julian, the ops coordinator, never mentioned her. Valerie, the PR lead, asked the media to avoid static displays. Derek, the face of the fighter unit, laughed when someone asked about cargo lifts. He called them ghosts, always fueled, never flown. Out on the field, the heat rose in waves. Fighter crews wiped down surfaces that were already clean. Photographers adjusted their filters to catch more sparkle off the glass. No one turned to see the old aircraft baking in the sun. No one asked what it took to keep her flight ready in that heat. No one watched as Nico checked the landing gear by touch or traced the fuel feed line along the undercarriage. Her gloves were already warm from metal contact, but she moved with steady hands. Noting each adjustment in pencil on a clipboard no one would read. Ezra ran diagnostics again, even though he'd already done it twice. He wasn't bored. He was making sure. Wells unrolled straps along the inner cargo wall, checking for fray. Drew checked wind patterns against old maps, even though newer aircraft had automation for that. They worked not because someone was watching, but because they knew how fast things could change, because they had flown missions without press kits, because they had landed in places where no one waited with applause. And yet, here on this field, their kind of readiness wasn't valuable. It wasn't glossy. It didn't look good on camera, so it was ignored. Every time Nico passed the fighter row, she felt eyes brush past her and move on. Every time she entered the tent, her name wasn't on the board, and still, she prepared. Because this was a place where image was valued over instinct, where scripted confidence was louder than quiet skill, where everything ran on the assumption that systems would work and light would hold. But Nico and her team knew better. They didn't dress for photo ops. They dressed for night flights and emergency landings. They didn't wait for assignments. They stayed ready for when everything polished and prepared fell apart. And even though no one said it, even though no one planned for it, this field would one day depend on them. Not because they were the stars of the show, but because when the spotlight failed, they would still be there, ready, silent, and real. The air inside the operations tent was cool, but tense, filled with the low hum of computers and the occasional static from a headset. Screens blinked with clean lines and colored grids, each showing trajectories, fuel loads, and aircraft IDs in perfect coordination. At the center, Julian stood over a digital table, eyes moving fast, voice clipped as he called out updates. Nico stepped in quietly, not hesitating but not forcing her presence either. In one hand, she held a folded flight plan printed on real paper. The margins were lined with pencil notes, each one carefully drawn from terrain scans and wind patterns, the kind of detail software didn't always catch. She moved to the edge of the planning table, not too close to interrupt, but close enough to offer. Julian didn't look up. His fingers kept scrolling through icons. Without waiting for her words, he raised one hand slightly, not to greet, but to stop. Support aircraft aren't flying this round. That was all he said. No review, no question, no interest in what she had brought. He turned to another screen. His attention moved on. Across the tent, Valerie's voice floated in from the open flap. She was briefing a camera crew, making sure they kept to the primary zone. Her tone was smooth and confident, like she was guiding a tour. Behind her, a row of media badges bobbed on lanyards as people filed through the perimeter gate. Nico didn't reply. She didn't argue. She let the brief sit on the edge of the table and stepped back. The silence behind her felt sharper than anything spoken. From the corner, Derek watched the exchange with faint amusement. He leaned one shoulder against a steel rack, arms crossed, mouth curled slightly. When Nico passed, he didn't say her name. He just shook his head and muttered something about crate haulers playing soldier. No one corrected him. No one asked for her input. They had already decided who mattered, and she wasn't on that list. Outside, the sunlight hit her face as she exited the tent, but it didn't shift her expression. She didn't pause. She didn't look back. She crossed the flight line the same way she always did. Without rush. Without distraction. Her crew saw her coming. Drew, leaning near the nose gear, straightened but said nothing. Wells, seated on the rear crate, tilted his head once, a quiet check-in that didn't need words. Ezra didn't look up from his readout, but his hand paused slightly over the dial. They had seen her walk in with the plan. They had seen her walk out with nothing taken. No one asked what was said. They already knew. Nico gave no commands. She didn't change her tone. She simply walked to the base of the ramp, opened the clipboard pouch, and slipped the brief back inside. Not because it wasn't valid, but because it hadn't been given space. The checklist remained. The system checks continued. Ezra adjusted his panel readout. Drew rechecked the side fuel gauge. Wells stood and tested the rear harness straps. Nothing had changed in their task, but something small had shifted in the air around them. The weight of being invisible, again, settled in. Not the loud kind of exclusion, the quiet kind, the kind where no one stops you, but also no one sees you, where readiness doesn't register unless it wears the right badge or makes the right noise. Nico didn't fight it. She had stopped doing that a long time ago. She simply stayed ready, because she knew that lists and briefings and media plans didn't decide who mattered in the end. The mission did, And missions had a way of stripping the shine off the surface. What lasted was what worked. Juliet 4 had worked for years without recognition. She had flown more miles than most of the jets being photographed. Her crew had trained longer than most of the faces smiling in the media tent. But they weren't in the spotlight. They weren't called when things ran smooth. They were the fallback, the afterthought, the ones remembered only when the others ran out of luck. And that was fine. They didn't need to be announced. They just needed to be ready for the moment when things went quiet, when the grid went dark, when plans didn't hold. Nico stood at the edge of the ramp, the heat climbing up from the tarmac. She watched the line of jets across the field. They sparkled like awards on a shelf. Cameras circled them like bees. No one turned toward her. No one asked where her crew would be if things failed. And still, she stayed, one hand resting on the metal hatch, her eyes calm, her name not on the list, her mission not approved, but her plane fully checked, and her team already in place. The cabin inside Juliet 4 was cooler than the ramp, its shadows deeper and still. Nico moved up the loading steps without speaking, her boots steady on the metal rungs. Behind her, Wells checked the sidewall webbing, pulling each strap through its buckle, then pulling again just to be sure. Drew leaned over a weather feed mounted near the control panel, comparing the readout to the wind notes scribbled in his logbook. He didn't say anything, but his eyes followed her movements. Ezra sat cross-legged near the rear sensor pod, fingers adjusting the signal tuner by feel more than sight. There was no need for instruction. Each person moved like part of a known rhythm, each task completed not from urgency, but from habit, built under pressure. Nico stepped into the cockpit and rested one hand lightly on the panel. She didn't look at the instruments yet. She looked down at a slip of folded paper taped beneath the glare shield. The paper was worn, creased at the folds, and yellowing at the corners. It held a hand-drawn approach map, sketched in pencil over graph lines, the curves marked with shorthand symbols only a few could read. Her mother had drawn it during a blackout run in the Central Pacific, a night mission flown without radio, without lights, without backup. Nico brushed her fingers along the edge of the page, not to confirm a route, but to connect to a memory that lived in the muscle. Her mother had flown through silence. She had flown by trust in terrain and wind and the feel of the yoke under her hands. Nico had studied this map as a girl, then as a cadet, then as a co-pilot learning to read the air without asking. She didn't bring it out to show anyone. She brought it because she knew what it meant. That even when the world went quiet, even when systems blinked out, some paths still remained. You just had to remember how to follow them. Outside, the ramp shimmered with heat, but inside the Hercules, it felt like another world. A quieter one shaped by discipline and memory and work that didn't need to be announced. She sat in the pilot's seat and pulled the clipboard from its mount. Her own flight plan was there. Beneath the official manifest was a second sheet in her handwriting, marked with alternative vectors and approach curves. It wasn't approved. It wasn't on the grid. But she had drawn it anyway, that morning, before the first crews arrived, just in case. Not because she expected to be needed, but because she believed in being ready when others were not. Ezra adjusted a panel housing and glanced toward the cockpit. Nico gave him a slight nod. It was enough. Drew clipped his harness to the frame, then went back to checking barometric pressure. Wells pulled a crate into place near the rear wall and sat with one boot braced, watching the light shift on the ramp. No one spoke. There was no reason to. What needed to be said had already been said through years of flying together, through engine stalls in the mountains, through rough landings in places without tarmac, through nights when the radios failed and they'd still gotten everyone home. Nico folded the top sheet of the manifest back over the hand-drawn sketch and slid the board into its holder. She didn't need to look again. The course was already in her mind, the feel of the field, the shape of the descent, the crosswind vectors. Juliet 4 remained still. Her systems powered down, her panels dark. But the energy inside wasn't idle. It was waiting. The kind of quiet that comes not from absence, but from deep, layered readiness. No one had called her name. No briefing had assigned her a role. But her team was in place. Her tools were prepped. Her legacy was alive in the margin notes and fold lines of a map drawn before half the jets outside had even been built. And when the moment came, if it came, she wouldn't have to decide. She would already be in motion. Not because someone asked, but because someone needed to. And she knew what it felt like to fly without permission. She had learned from the best. The lights went out like a breath pulled from the room. First, a flicker across the monitors. Then, silence. The tower stopped transmitting. The radar screens blinked once and turned black. Outside, the field dimmed, and the long rows of runway strobes vanished into nothing. At first, no one moved. The hum of cooling units died. The fans slowed. Inside the ops tent, voices froze mid-sentence. Valerie looked down at her tablet and tapped the screen, but it stayed dark. Julian leaned over the master panel and hit the reset key twice. Nothing responded. Above the field, 5 aircraft held pattern, 2 military, 3 civilian. They circled in wide arcs, too high to land by guess, too low to climb out of range. Their pilots waited for guidance, but no voice came. The tower was silent. The comms loop only gave back static and broken echo. On the ground, the confidence drained fast. Technicians whispered. Crews looked around for instruction. The broadcast tent shut down in one long, sighing fade. Backup systems that were supposed to flick on didn't. Even the generator outside the control tent stalled mid-cycle, stuttered once, and died. Inside the command station, Julian slammed a manual override switch, then looked to the backup relay. The feed was empty. Valerie held her tablet like a dead weight in one hand. The screen showed a single blinking warning. No network. No uplink. Derek stepped into the tent, face tight, eyes scanning for someone to blame. He asked if drones were up. No one answered. Then he asked louder. Someone muttered about relays failing upstream. He didn't hear, or didn't want to. In the sky, one of the jets radioed down with a broken signal. The message fractured on impact. Something about altitude hold, then silence. A second plane sent a ping. It cut off halfway through a request for visual approach. Julian paced to the front panel again, staring at screens that didn't glow. Behind him, Valerie tried to connect her headset. She turned slowly, still expecting someone to fix it. Still believing protocol had a fix. The only movement came from outside, where shadows shifted in the distance, and crews near the media row gathered with phones that couldn't load. Some tried flashlights. Some tried calls. None of it worked. The airfield had gone still. Not just quiet. Still. Like the pause before something breaks. Every aircraft overhead had enough fuel for a few more loops. After that, they'd either need coordinates or risk a blind descent. And there were no coordinates left to give. No one spoke it out loud, but the truth hung heavy in the heat. They were watching the edges of control unravel, and there was no protocol for this moment, not one that worked without power. Across the field, Juliet 4 sat like a shadow cast too long. Her metal shell caught no flash. Her lights were out like the rest, but she hadn't been waiting for lights. She had been waiting for quiet. Inside her bay, Ezra turned the aux dial on the backup comm. He moved slowly, listening between the noise. Finally, he landed on a low-band emergency frequency. It came through in bits, chopped and tinny. One voice. No vector. No clearance. Do not attempt approach. Repeat. Do not attempt. He looked up toward the cockpit. Nico was already halfway up the ladder. She hadn't spoken. She didn't need to. The rest of the crew moved like they had heard something too, even if nothing had been said. Drew stood with one hand on the nav station, mouth slightly open but silent. Wells didn't rise yet. He just turned his head toward her and waited. Outside the Hercules, the field was a black canvas. No stars. No strobes. Inside, only the faint blue edge of battery light blinked once on the control panel. And nothing else. No call. No clearance. No command. Just waiting. Just air, thick with heat and worry. Just a field that had counted too long on systems that had never failed. Until now. Nico didn't ask for confirmation. She didn't wait for someone to signal. She stepped into the cockpit and sat with a quiet precision that said, this was never a question. Her gloves came off her belt and landed on the left seat. Her fingers moved along the overhead panel, flipping each switch in sequence. No rush. No hesitation. Just movement shaped by years of doing it the right way. The backup battery responded with a faint hum. It wasn't much, just enough to light the dash and power the essential systems. The panel flickered once, then steadied into a low blue glow. She reached for the checklist clipped to the side rail. Her thumb tapped the top of the page twice. Not out of habit, but out of memory. Drew saw it and didn't need explanation. He climbed into the right seat and buckled his harness. His hands moved slower than hers, but he mirrored her actions. One glance at the instruments, then back to her face. She nodded once. That was enough. Ezra turned the gain on the emergency comm down to a low hum and locked it. There was no new signal, no fresh call, just fragments in the static and a voice that had already warned them away. Wells pulled the ramp lever to partial. The rear hatch opened just enough to let the air pass through, cool and heavy. Outside, the field looked like a cutout. No tower lights, no taxi lines, just dark. Nico adjusted the throttle lock, then the trim tab, then the hydraulic bleed, each motion quiet and clean. She didn't need to read the labels. Her hand already knew them. The startup sequence wasn't full. It couldn't be. There was no radar, no guided nav, just battery, just trim, just feel. That would have to be enough. Ezra walked up to the nav relay and checked the stabilizer one last time. It spun briefly, then held. He gave a small nod and sat back. Drew looked out the side window and saw nothing. He turned back to Nico, unsure. She spoke for the first time, just 2 words. That's enough. He didn't reply. He placed his palm on the yoke and felt the subtle vibration as Juliet 4 came to life. Wells stepped forward and leaned against the wall behind them. His eyes were on the field, but his mind was somewhere further ahead. He didn't ask where they were going. He just said, low and certain, I hope they're watching. Nico kept her gaze ahead. They're not, she said, but they'll follow. With one more check, she moved the selector for ignition. 1, then 2. The engines responded with a slow build, the hum deepening into a soft growl beneath their feet. The aircraft shifted gently. Not forward. Just alive. Nico adjusted the fuel line, then signaled to Ezra. He gave a quick thumbs up, then turned his attention back to the sensor panel. Drew called out air pressure. It held. Wind vector was minimal. They had enough to clear the rise if they climbed clean. The brakes released with a short hiss. Juliet 4 rolled slow. No strobe flashed, no clearance light turned green, just the sound of tires against tarmac, just the breath of 4 people who had already made peace with what came next. They taxied across a runway that had lost all shape. No edge lights, no markers. Nico steered by feel and angle, by memory, by the way the gravel shifted beneath the gear. At the threshold, she paused, not to think, but to listen. One last moment to confirm. No signal, no change, no better plan. She opened the throttle. The response was smooth. The aircraft pulled forward with the weight of something that didn't need permission. It gathered speed with a kind of stubborn grace, not fast, but sure. Drew held his breath when the pitch lifted. He didn't mean to. His fingers gripped the console, even though he trusted her. There was no call-out, no official lift, but the ground fell away. They rose into nothing. The sky above was moonless, the field below, invisible. There were no reference points, just motion, just trust. Juliet 4 climbed steady. The engines holding even. Drew looked out again, still seeing only dark. No outline. No line of sight. He said they had no horizon. Nico answered, soft and simple, "Yes, we do." And with that, they flew. Not guided. Not granted. Just lifted. Just ready. Just right. The wheels touched down without sound. No bounce. No slip. Just contact. Soft and certain. Like the earth had been waiting for her to return. Juliet 4 rolled to a stop near the center of the empty runway. No tower cleared her. No system guided her in. But she landed with a precision no map could promise. Inside the cockpit, Nico reached for the switch labeled Floodlight Override. She flipped it once. The wingtip lights blinked on, white and clean, casting wide arcs across the dark tarmac. In the air, one aircraft shifted, then another. They had been holding pattern too long, burning fuel in silence, waiting for a sign. Now, they saw it. The glow from Juliet 4 didn't shout. It didn't demand. It offered a shape to follow, a path to trust. One jet dropped into pattern and began descent. Then a second, each one aligned not to radar or vector, but to the light spread from her wings. They touched down behind her, slow and steady, their paths guided by the arc she had drawn in motion. Inside the operations tent, screens were still dead, but the people weren't. They stood watching a monitor that ran off a separate battery. One small cam feed, barely lit, showed the runway from a wide angle. They watched as Juliet 4 glowed alone in the frame. Then another jet entered. Then another. None of them had been cleared. None had data. But they were coming down. And they were landing clean. Julian leaned in toward the screen. His hand rested flat on the table. He didn't speak. He just stared at the moment they never planned for. Valerie stood beside him, tablet limp at her side. The battery had long since drained, but her eyes didn't move from the footage. She saw what it meant, what it changed. Derek stepped into the tent just in time to see a fourth plane touch down. He froze, watching the screen like it was playing something he didn't believe. The camera panned slightly, and there she was. Juliet 4. Still. Centered. Her lights the only constant on a field that had gone quiet. Back in the cockpit, Nico didn't move from her seat. She didn't speak to the crew. She didn't look for credit. Her hand rested on the throttle. Her eyes stayed on the instruments. Now, dark again, except for the panel glow. Behind her, Ezra monitored the backup comm. Static had softened. The black channel was quiet. Drew exhaled, hands still on the yoke, feeling the weight of what they'd done settle in. Wells stood in the open ramp, arms crossed, watching the line form behind them. One by one, the jets came in. No fanfare, no spotlight, just motion, just trust. Inside the tent, someone whispered the obvious. No one ordered this. No one signed off. Julian finally said it out loud, but they followed her. And in that moment, it was clear. The system had failed. The plan had broken, but they had still landed. Because one aircraft decided the mission didn't need permission. Because one woman acted when no one else did. Juliet 4 had not waited. She had led, without command, without clearance, only light, only presence, only enough. The field lights came back in pieces, first a hum, then a flicker, then a slow return to brightness, not sudden, not complete, but enough. Screens blinked alive inside the operations tent, panels rebooted, names and vectors reappeared. The system caught up with itself. It logged aircraft that had already landed, too late to be useful. No one said much. Heads turned, eyes tracked, but voices stayed low. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was something closer to realization. They all knew what had happened. Juliet 4 had landed first, without clearance, without radar, without a green light. She had touched down when no one else would move, and her lights had brought everyone else home. Julian stood over the console, scrolling back through logs. He frowned when he reached the slot where her ID should have been. It was blank, no entry, no registration, no timestamp, just space. He leaned closer, pulled up the raw data stream. Nothing. She hadn't been slotted. She wasn't on the flight board. Her role was listed only as pending support. No primary task. No assigned route. Behind him, Valerie stared at the replay from the tower cam. The footage looped on a silent screen. It showed a wide stretch of darkness. Then, out of that void, a shape descended. Steady. Centered. Clean. The lights flared on after wheels met pavement. Then, behind her, the rest followed. No orders had called them down. No tower voice gave permission. They came because they saw her. Derek stood near the back wall, arms crossed. He watched the same footage but didn't say anything. His jaw tightened once, then relaxed. He knew what it meant. Outside, the tarmac had resumed its rhythm. Crews walked between jets. Refuel lines connected. Reports were written. But something in the air felt changed. People moved with purpose, but without the noise from earlier. The laughter was softer, the chatter quieter. A few turned their heads toward Juliet 4, still parked near the end of the runway. She hadn't moved. Her engines were off. Her lights still blinked in slow rhythm. Not urgent, not showy, just steady. Inside the aircraft, Ezra completed his post-flight check. He noted battery draw, fuel usage, and external pressure. Drew copied the last of the readings into the logbook and set it on the dashboard. Wells stood at the open ramp, watching the field. He didn't speak. He didn't shift. He just looked. Nico sat in the pilot seat, one hand still resting on the throttle. She hadn't powered down the console yet. The low blue lights lit her face in a way that didn't ask for anything. She wasn't waiting. She was reflecting. In her lap sat the same clipboard, the one she'd carried all day. The top page held the base manifest. Below it, her own sketch. 3 vectors. One final note in pencil. Landed, blackout, centerline hold. No timestamp. No clearance number. But it was exact. Anyone who read it would know what it meant. Julian finally turned from the screen and walked back to the main console. He tapped once more on the flight board. Still no record for her entry. But there was a camera angle he couldn't stop watching. The one where she arrived. He looked across the room at Valerie, who still held her silent tablet. Her eyes didn't move from the paused image. She didn't blink. She just stood there, holding something she couldn't explain. No one issued a citation. No medal was prepared, but word was already moving. Not in the official reports, in the space between them. On the ground, Nico stepped down from the aircraft. Her gloves were looped back through her belt. Her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She didn't speak. She didn't wait. She just walked. Ezra followed at a quiet pace, eyes forward. Drew fell in behind them, still watching her, trying to understand something he'd only just felt. Wells brought up the rear, a slow gait. Nothing rushed. Nothing for show. They didn't break stride when people turned. They didn't stop when a crew tech whispered low. They just kept walking, like they always had. Quiet. Certain. Done. Someone said under their breath that her call sign would change after this. Nico didn't look over. She said, low but clear, they won't need to. Juliet 4 remained parked. No lights on the tower angled toward her. No press moved in for a photo. But the line of jets behind her said more than ceremony ever could. The ones who followed her knew. The ones who landed because of her knew. And the ones who almost didn't make it would never forget. Back in the tent, Julian scrolled one last time through the manifest. He reached the end. Someone had scanned a page in... It wasn't from the system. It was hand-drawn. Pencil on paper. 1 flight, 1 note, altitude at approach, crosswind correction, visibility 0. He read it twice, then stopped. There was nothing else to add. Nico never asked to lead. She never needed to be chosen. She just stayed ready. And when the time came, when everything else fell silent, she moved. That was the lesson. Not in volume, not in title, in presence, in action, in knowing what had to be done and doing it with hands that never shook. She flew because someone had to, and she knew it would be her. Some people wait for permission. Others prepare until the moment no one else can rise. And when the lights go out, you'll know who's who.